Italian tanks earned their place in history not for having the best armor or for having the best weaponry, but for having many strange designs and having questionable effectiveness. Italy was one of the first powers to acquire tanks and incorporate the tank concept into their armed forces. In 1920, production would begin on the Fiat 3000 based on the French Renault FT-17. It was a fairly modern tank, considering that the FT-17 had a maximum speed of 6 kilometers and the Fiat 3000 had a maximum speed of 18 kilometers per hour. So the Fiat 3000 was a fairly fast tank for its time. It had good armor, was very light and effective, especially against infantry, and in fact it could be said that Italy in the early 20s had one of the best tanks, if not the best light tank of the time. However, by the middle of World War II, Italy was the country with the worst tanks in Europe. How did Italy go from having the best designs in the 20s to having the worst tanks in military history in World War II? Well, the history of Italian tanks is full of scandals, corruption, and a lot of government negligence. The Fiat 3000, while an agile tank, was falling short by 1925. In the reconquest of Libya in 1926, the Fiat 3000 seemed a bit limited in terms of the main armament. And in that conflict, this problem seemed much more evident. It used two SIA Model 1918 machine guns of 6.5 millimeters. The Fiat 3000 needed an urgent modernization, and the modernization came with the Model 30. Having very substantial improvements and like a 37mm cannon, also considerable improvements in the engine and suspension, but this modernization would not come until 1930. By the 30s, the Fiat 3000 seemed very limited in terms of armor. In its strong points, it had 16 millimeters thick. That is, it had almost the same armor as the German Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251. It could stop rifle shots, but a cannon shot of a caliber greater than 12 millimeters could perfectly pierce the armor. In addition to its main armament only having a range of 80 meters, it was really ineffective against modern tanks. Despite this, it was extensively used against several African countries, later against Greece, and even when the Allies arrived in Sicily in 1943, the Italian army was still using the Fiat 3000 tanks. In Africa, it had a regular performance since the African armies barely had a way to face armored vehicles. But in Sicily, they were destroyed very easily since they were very slow and lacked an effective enough range to face the Allied tanks. There are even reports of Fiat 3000 tanks being destroyed by grenades. In Sicily, many of these were eventually buried and used as pillboxes because they were no longer effective for fighting. Going back to 1929, along with the modernization of the 30 model of the Fiat 3000, a vehicle based on the British carton, Lloyd Mk6 began to be developed that would fill the role of a light and agile armored vehicle, since the Fiat 3000 with the modernization of the 30 model was no longer going to have machine guns, and this was essentially slow for the time. The new vehicle would take 4 years to develop and would not arrive until 1933. This was called the CV-33 Tankette, or L333. It was very economical and easy to produce. In addition, it was very agile for the time. It could reach 40 kilometers per hour. Also, its small size gave it a very good advantage. It was very difficult to hit it with a tank shot. But it had many obvious problems. Its size was very small to accommodate the two-man crew it generally required. The tank commander, whenever possible, would sit on top of the tank to give space to the driver, as this vehicle only had a height of 1.3 meters and a width of 1.4 meters. Its armor was very poor, and this vehicle was practically born obsolete in the North African campaigns in 1940. It was not deployed on the front line and was relegated to logistics tasks such as towing artillery or carrying supply boxes. In 1940, Italy's situation regarding armored vehicles was really critical. Technically, Italy had no tanks to fight with. In this year, they used the Fiat L640 and the Fiat 1139 extremely ineffective tanks. For the time, they were really obsolete, so in response to the need, the MTC-40 emerged, considered by experts as Italy's first medium tank. Its design, as is customary in Italian tanks, was based on a foreign tank, in this case, the British Vickers 6-stone. Like its predecessors, it didn't achieve much or almost anything. When it came into service, the crews were practically not trained to use it. In addition, they were not even given radios to communicate among them during battles, so they couldn't coordinate or strategize. By 1941, this tank was really obsolete. It had a 42mm armor at its strongest points, and this was not inclined. Most versions were made of very poor quality steel, and many times, despite resisting a shot, it would crack or even fracture. Completely its shy 41mm cannon, it could barely scratch the armors of the British Crusader III or the M3 Lee and M4 Sherman. And of course, these modern tanks were capable of penetrating the armor of the M1340 very, very, very easily. A very bad thing about the Italian tanks was that their armor was riveted, not welded, so when it received a shot inside the tank, the rivets were shot out, causing injuries to the crews similar to shrapnel. The M340S passed without pain or glory and were quickly replaced by the Samo 2075-18. This seemed to be a design inspired by the Stuggy 3, as it was specifically designed as a tank hunter. A very characteristic 75mm cannon, which was really effective and was very useful against Allied tanks, being able to easily penetrate the armor of the Crusader III and the M4 Sherman at 450 meters distance. Unfortunately, Italy barely managed to build 250 of these tanks, so there were too few to make a difference on the battlefield. At the twilight of the Italian government, it made a pact with the Germans to produce the Panzer V Panther in Italy. But in September of 1944, the Italian government would fall. And this would be the end of the story of the Italian tanks. Between the 30s and the end of the Second World War, the advancement in armaments was such that tanks had to be constantly renewed and modernized. All powers understood this to perfection to a greater or lesser extent. In the case of Italy, it took a long time to modernize or create new designs, so much so that every time they released a new design, it was already obsolete. In Italy, governmental negligence and corruption were very prominent, so the government gave contracts to private companies that were really incompetent when it came to designing military armored vehicles to make tank designs, and in the end, these companies made designs of very questionable quality, which were approved by the government since there were interests behind it. Also, the constant economic crises in the country made the government not very enthusiastic about financing tank designs that they would not be able to produce in the end, because they were too costly. The Italians produced less than 4,000 tanks, which is a ridiculous number if we compare it with the American tank production of 51,200 tanks.